when people want to ask a question, if you're familiar with chat, just type the word stack over in chat. That way we can see who asked questions or wants to make a comment first. And I don't have to roam over the screen to see who's raising their hand first. So questions, comments from the floor. And there is one that Paul Gray did type to everyone that he has there first, and I will read aloud from it in the chat. Here's the question. It strikes Paul that of all platform workers, those who face the most challenges when trying to organize are the lower skilled online crowd workers. That is, global competition on the labor market, unclear jurisdictions with respect to laws, regulations, etc. Do you, Ursula, or anyone else have any ideas about overcoming these challenges? So that is question one. And if there are any others, we could have Ursula take a few at a time. And we have Anka Mihaela.
Yeah, it's Anka. Thank you so much. I am a platform worker, so I'm part of the Cybertariat, and I've just discovered the concept. So thank you so much for enlightening me and for bringing me here. And in my process of working in this industry, I've been involved in different networks where I found different narratives of how this platform worker is conceived. So some individuals see it as a start in their career and then leave it and let place for others to come. Then there's this romanticized perspective in which the individual has a freedom of choice, expression, and becomes the small entrepreneur. But obviously this narrative ignores the broader power structures that are in place. And lastly, although I think there are more narratives to it, is the platform working being explained as empowerment process for the global South, which I think it's quite valid. It's a way in which the global South takes advantage. So my question is, how in this multifaceted context can one put forth a narrative that actually focuses on workers' rights? Because I feel that this is not discussed enough. And I don't know, I'm quite pessimistic in the idea of class consciousness. Thank you so much.
Well, this is something I'm doing a lot of research on right now, and you're quite right. There's a sort of triumphalist narrative on some of our younger comrades on the left, in Europe anyway, whereby especially food delivery riders and Uber drivers are seen as a kind of new vanguard. You know, they often go in the same way that back in the 1970s, their probably grandparents went and worked in auto factories because they thought that's kind of where the action was of the working class, and did participant observation in auto factories. They tend to go and do participant observation as a food delivery rider and write PhDs about it. And they write these terrifically positive tales about how these workers are organizing, and there have indeed been demonstrations and so on. There's some sort of issues around that. One set of issues is around that it's like the way that they can organize for the same reason that the dockers could organize in the 19th and 20th century, because they're out on they're on the street waiting for it. Indeed, outside my house is one of the places they congregate, and so they're all hanging around together waiting for work. So their competition is very much tempered by collaboration. And yes, we all want to accept that task, but it's your turn, kind of stuff going on among them, so that they can meet each other and they can organize. But according to our research, they're greatly outnumbered by other kinds of platform workers who don't get to meet each other on the street or recognize each other by the way they're dressed or the cars they're driving or whatever. Particularly these online workers who are working very invisibly in global labor markets on the one hand, and on the other hand are the domestic workers working in people's homes. And these are both groups of workers that have historically, the domestic workers have historically always been very, very hard to organise. If you go back to the 1880s, you know, when women workers in factories were organising very successfully, helped by Eleanor Marx, you know, they were greatly outnumbered in the workforce by domestic servants. So, you know, something like, I think, a quarter of all women were working as domestic servants, who were very, very hard to organise. And in fact, looking globally, the only examples I know of where domestic workers have successfully organised has been where it's been linked to larger political campaigns, like in South Africa, where it was linked with the anti-apartheid campaign, and in the Philippines, where it was linked to much larger political mobilizations. And indeed in California right now, where the Domestic Workers Alliance is linked with broader political movements. So, and the lesson I take from that is a lesson that's been around, again, as long as there've been trade unions, really, is that you do need organized trade unions. It's always good to have a vanguard to negotiate something with an employer and give hope to everyone else. But you also need political parties and general demands that generalize those new rights across everybody. If you just win rights for Deliveroo riders, then all you're doing is creating a new kind of elite small group of workers. What is needed is a political way to generalize those rights. Now, about this question of entrepreneurship, and this is a very real issue, and it's quite a broad issue. We find even in, for instance, I've been doing a lot of interviews in London with platform workers. They come into two very different categories. One is like students and artists and people who are doing it to top up their regular income, and who see it as gig work, and who are generally the ones who are very happy to join a union, perhaps because they have less to lose. And then we have other people who see it as a business, who newly arrived immigrants in particular, often supporting a family back home in Bangladesh or wherever it is, who have invested in their Uber car and work all the hours God gives and see this as their business and have a self-perception very much that they're an entrepreneur and they're going to do well, and their kids are going to go to school and do something better than what they're doing, and they're supporting their families. And it's a very different consciousness, if you like, although they're doing the same work for the same platforms. And coming back to the platform workers, it is actually really de facto a new form of entrepreneurialism for some. If you look at platforms like Upwork, for instance, you might find somebody, for instance, somewhere like Georgia, or you know, it's quite a lot in Central Asia. There's quite a lot. You get this phenomenon, but also in Pakistan, I've come across it. Somebody who builds up a good profile on Upwork as a, I don't know, a graphic designer or a software designer or whatever, and gets a high rating, which means they get more pay. And then using that identity, they get more and more work and farm it out. And they end up becoming an employer who's got maybe half a dozen other workers working for them, which is a very traditional, and you get exactly the same thing on Etsy. Etsy is a craft platform, and you think you've got some nice old granny knitting these hats for you. And in fact, you've got a picture of a nice old granny and somebody with a sweatshop employing 80 people doing the knitting in awful conditions in another part of the world. These things are extremely complicated. And I don't think it's useful to abstract these workers as a special kind of worker. I think it's more useful to see them in their broader geographical and class context, if you like. Sorry, that was a very long answer, and I think Greg has his hand up.
Go ahead, Greg.
Just to following on some of Ursula's observation, I think one could see kind of three areas where organizing should be possible in a very deep sense. There's a lot of servicing, Ursula mentioned, but if you just put it a different way, there's a lot of service provisioning that still has to be very spatially specific, as in the Fedora and all the rest of it. So even if organized, some of the allocation of the work is organized digitally, there should be some capacity to organize the workers because they're so spatially specific in the service provisioning. So they still have some concentrations. The second, I think, area is in logistic nodes and choke points. You know, there are massive choke points and logistic nodes such as Amazon or the docks, et cetera, all those should be kind of conceivably organized. There's mass fixed capital at those nodes, and supposedly, therefore, lots of workers are doing it, and therefore the potential. A third, I think, is exactly what Ursula mentioned in terms of services which are provided horribly by the market, but still might be completely interlaced with digital provisioning. You know, and almost every kind of thing that was in the public sector before is so overlaced with digital provisioning or digital infrastructure related to it. You know, any of the water, service, transport, and so on and so forth, and being brought back into the public sector, or the struggle over decommodifying it should allow also service provisioning there. It's even in certain things like where we're having difficulty, but the pandemic is showing us how badly it's being done in this form of organizing, such as in personal service workers for seniors and so on. There should be some potential to argue for it being brought into the public service sector, decommodified and being seen as part of the of healthcare provisioning, and then also organizing. I think, you know, it's just, well, maybe I'll add one more. Even to some extent, some of the digital sweatshots for coding, et cetera, are mass, but then it's so dispersed and everybody just linked it. You know, some of it suggests that the coders should be able to communicate better than they do about organizing. But I think all of these are sometimes less put on by technological abilities, but the fact that the union movements aren't taking these on in a mass way that's necessary to kind of reach out to these new sectors to organize. They're just not doing a great job. And I think that speaks in different ways to the same political problem, or the political limits of doing that Ursula just mentioned at the end there.
Can I come back on that? It's because there is one form of action which is very interesting, which is taking place right now. There's a group of Uber drivers and Ola drivers from Portugal, from the UK, and from the Netherlands, who are taking Uber to court in the Netherlands, which is where the headquarters is, for complicated tax reasons. Taking them to court in order to see the algorithm. That their argument is that the algorithm is dictating their working conditions, and so they need to be able to see it. And they're using European data protection law to see the algorithm, and that seems like an incredibly interesting precedent, because if they win, that's a right that can be generalized across so many workers, across so many industries. I just wanted to throw that in. I forgot to mention it. And of course, the other thing is that my new book is called Reinventing the Welfare State. It's the idea of developing locally based public platforms is a very key idea in that book. Sorry, I'll stop because Stephen has a question too, I think.
Well, Katie is first. She was at STEP, and then Steve. Go ahead, Katie.
Oh, thanks. Thanks very much, Ursula. I think this might connect with the previous question and some of the things also that others have been saying. Like you were talking about some of the examples of unionizing domestic workers or migrant workers, and how the potential of these is strongest when it's linked to broader kind of political demands that maybe large, I don't think you said the word large unions, but I suppose it springs to mind in coming from the UK also. I'm thinking that we have here over the past few years, these base unions that are very characterized by some of the kind of like enthusiastic academic vanguard left people, but also have done like really amazing work organizing in lots of sectors on a small scale that people have felt like weren't very easy to organize. So sex workers, cleaners, yeah, but I suppose like it's been a real struggle, my experience of working alongside comrades who do some of that organising, that the larger unions aren't very interested in taking on that challenge and like also getting involved in trying to organise in these areas. And I wonder if partly that connects to some of the broader kind of like limitations that maybe people were saying that Leo would speak about, like this, you know, you mentioned the reserve army of Labour being, they're not domestic anymore. And so there's these attitudes of like racism and xenophobia that are a lot more acceptable, that people like Corbyn have had to basically, you know, they find themselves limited and constrained by this popular discourse, which is like basically migrant labour people aren't interested in rights for them. And I guess my question, if there is one, is like, aside from the unions and political parties, you know, like Labour and kind of like the left within those bits, like trying to kind of, you know, drag the party left, etc. What do you think of other strategies like the women's strike as a kind of alternative, like way to organise across the working class, but like not via these like institutional structures that we've seen have so many limitations? I'd particularly be really interested to hear what you think of the women's strike as a kind of you know, how it's working in Spain, Argentina, and other places like this.
Steve, you had a comment?
Oh yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, so just kind of connecting with what Ursula and Greg just said, I wanted to kind of pose another issue, which is that, so yeah, Ursula very importantly, I think, mentioned the importance of political organizing and the limits of trade unions as a model on their own to accomplish the task that is really before this class of workers, or this strata of the working class. And part of that, which certainly there in Toronto, we had a successful unionization campaign of Foodora workers. But as soon as the unionization drive was successful, Foodora packed up and left. And this gets at a fundamental problem, I think, a limit or a difficulty, a challenge to this kind of organizing, which is that so many of these companies are struggling to be profitable. They're barely profitable, if at all. Some of them have no plans to become profitable in the future. And in a context where, you know, Greg mentioned the geographical specificity of some of the labor that has to get done, but there's also the kind of the other side of that, which is the fact that, at least in the case of Foodora, and I'd be curious for Ursula to elaborate a little more on some of the other examples, but at least in the case of Foodora, the company is basically organized as a financial group. So what they basically do is they go around the world buying up successful startups that do delivery services and then operating them and investing in them in contexts all over the world. I think a huge chunk of their investment is actually like in their fastest growing region is like Asia. So even if the work is specific to, say, Toronto or any city in the global north, the fact that capital remains mobile and that these companies, at least Foodora, has been restructured as a financial group, they can, you know, their investment is highly mobile all around the world. So that it poses a barrier to the organizing that can be done, because again, trade unions have this fundamental limit of being dependent on the profitability of their employer. So if your employer is not going to be profitable, if unionizing and raising wages and benefits is going to put the company out of business, the union's not going to amount to very much. So there is that fundamental barrier, and I wonder if Ursula could address those challenges.
Well, but Katie, first, your question about women's strikes. I don't know an awful lot about women's strikes. It's an area I'm a bit ignorant in. I've always been a bit skeptical about it. I remember going way back in the 70s. There was a group of women in a engineering factory that was part of Lucas Aerospace who formed a women's union because they were so disgusted with the way that the official union, although it was represented by some very celebrated leftists like Mike Cooley, their influence didn't get down to improving the conditions, these women's conditions down on the shop floor, and they were so disgusted they formed their own women's union, but it failed. And in my experience, these gender is a difficult category. I mean, obviously there are issues that are gender specific. When you look at the amazing mobilizations going on in Poland right now around abortion, which are very inspiring and important, and indeed also in Latin America, similarly, that women mobilizations by women around women's issues are enormously important. But I think to women as work to reduce your identity as a worker to the gender part of it is difficult. Yes, there's lots of scope for organizing as women within a broader union, or for making visible what it is that women are doing and so on. But and some of these new unions that are these new, mostly rather ephemeral unions that are springing up around in the UK right now. One of them, for instance, is foster parents, which is very much a gendered area, and it's clearly important. But my feeling is that if we really want to organise, improve conditions for cleaning workers, a much better way of doing it is to just start demanding public cleaning services for people who need them, and demanding that these become public sector jobs. And the same goes for care services. Bring them back. They used to be public sector jobs. Bring them back under public control. I've actually had a talk with a local authority in London. I better not mention which one it is, because it's very early stages, about using, because one of the things we've been doing research on is how these cleaners especially find jobs. They mostly try and avoid the platforms like the plague, and so they use platforms which are not really labour platforms. They use platforms like nextdoor.com, where people put ads up saying, has anybody seen my lost cat, and also people say, do you know a good electrician, and suggesting that maybe local authorities could start using platforms like that, for recruitment. So actually they're tapping into local communities to recruit local workers from local ethnic minority groups, and building and to start trying to build local platforms from the bottom up, where using the public authority, either its purchasing power or its employment power, to do it. Oh goodness, now I've forgotten what Steve's question was, and it was a really important thing I wanted to say.
Mine was about the fact that so many of these platform companies are not that profitable.
Oh right, yes, I remember. What Foodora did in Toronto is exactly what Deliveroo did in Berlin. As soon as the workers started organising, they pulled out. And it's a very standard strategy. And I think the problem here is to focus only on the company. I mean, it's always a problem in any kind of union organising when you've got private sector employers. But these are huge companies, and their local manifestations are always going to be difficult to deal with. If you accept their premise, oh, we've got to make a profit in Toronto, and we can't make a profit if you not organise, or we'll get out. Accepting that kind of premise is, I mean, I work for publishers, in the 1970s who said, oh, well, this publisher isn't making any money, we're going to make you all redundant. And then it would turn out to be that there was a parent company, and the parent company was writing it off as a tax loss in that country, but making an enormous profit in another country. And you just had to move the logic beyond what the company's logic was in order to win as a union. I mean, in that particular case, we had an occupation. It's this idea that platforms are not profitable. Yes, that's what they said about Amazon for years and years. Everybody said, yes, but Amazon doesn't make a profit. But it was almost like the point of Amazon was not in the short term to make a profit. The point of Amazon was to increase its market share to such an extent that it could shove out all the competition, all the little bookshops and everything, and be free to diversify in every way it wanted to diversify. Not making a profit on paper is the strategy of just about every large company all around the world right now, to avoid tax, if nothing else. So I think it's a bit of a red herring to sort of get into even bothering to look at whether or not this particular company in this particular place is making a profit. I think we need to take a broader view. Strategically, what's going on is that small businesses are being driven out, huge global businesses are expanding. They're very often using a business model which is based on rent rather than commodity production. Historically, that's very often a transitional stage. I mean, you can see this, well, it's stymied, but you can see this very classically with Uber, because Uber started off, just being about making money out of the use of other people's cars. And within 6 or 7 years of being founded, they were investing in self-driving cars, classic capitalist strategy whereby goods replace services. Sooner or later, after the next crisis, perhaps, these service industries will no longer be particularly profitable, and there'll be new kinds of technologies that take them to a new order of productivity. And we'll see once again, production workers replacing service workers in that sort of pendulum swing that's been going on throughout the history of capitalism. I don't want to be pessimistic about it, but I think with these kinds of very casual work, I mean, I have to keep emphasizing the majority of these platform workers, it's not their main job. They've got another main job. They are part of a pool of workers who do lots of different kinds of work for lots of different kinds of employers. And it seems to me that community-based organizing actually makes a lot more sense than company-based organizing. It could be that there's a potential for sector-based organizing. There are a lot of different models. It depends what the geography of union organization is in your particular city where you start. But I know that the London Fair Wage campaign about 10, 15 years ago that was so successful was successful because it built on a partnership between several different large trade unions and a whole number of community-based organizations. And the people who were involved in it is Deborah Lichtman, who's a Canadian, and she's now in Vancouver. She was one of the key figures in that. She was working for Unison at the time. And I remember her telling me how hard it was to persuade the union bureaucracies to go this route. But they were persuaded. And so how they recruited the workers, they went into Polish churches, they went into mosques, they went into Latin American community centers. They went wherever those workers were, wherever they lived, wherever they hung out. They went there, and that's where they recruited, and that's where they organized. And it was an extremely successful campaign. And it's one that some people in some unions really learned from. I don't know if there's a critical mass of them yet, but I just keep thinking, hoping that the new generation is coming through in the unions, and some of these momentum kids, there's a new generation coming through that I have put great faith in to try and shake things up a little bit.
So I do want to put up in front of my face Ursula's new book, because she will be back with the MEP on February 21st, which is, what is that? It's a few weeks from now. And we have plenty of her books because we are selling the books at a really low rate, and all of our prices include the media mail that we mail from in New York, in the US and Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, our book prices are only good in the US because the charges for international postage, which is something Capital got around to one way or another, pushes groups to use UPS or FedEx or whatever, DHL, these private groups. They've made the public post office for international shipments incredibly expensive. Herman is there asking a question.
Well, as I think of questions, Ursula is always answering them before, but just one comment and see what you think. There's been some difficulty in organizing in some places where, like in Amazon and places where the tendency is to look at larger political issues, not having to do with regulating the sector, about social justice and a whole series of things, but ignoring labor conditions, ignoring work intensity, ignoring people's rights in the workplace. And I wonder what your comment is that, because I think that has to go hand in hand with the bigger picture. And and the second question or point is that I think that I strongly agree that that you have to be able to figure out how to deliver these services that people want differently and have them and be involved in a different way. And that's absolutely critical. And we've worked with Deborah here in different ways and have some experience with it. I guess just one little other point is that, part of this has to do with the difficulty in building a political left that even argues for things like stopping capital mobility, outlawing some of this stuff if you get a social support for it, and actually changing labor laws to accommodate a different kind of a model that we're all used to. But in particular, things like capital mobility. Why should they be able to close down and move their investment somewhere else? Why should they have the right to do that? And shouldn't we be calling for that as part of the political the political perspective we bring today? So.
Yeah, so I wanted to just not push back, but maybe challenge Ursula a little bit on something that she said a minute ago. To me, in a way, almost the dilemma that a lot of the workers in the platform sector are in is reflective of the general paradox of organizing in neoliberalism in so many important ways. So we need a political level shift to impose something like capital controls, especially to limit capital mobility such that capital can't just pull out and move all around the world to find the cheapest labor costs and the lowest regulatory costs. But at the same time, a precondition for that is to have some kind of grassroots level mobilizing going on, which is why I agree with Ursula that I think community organizing can be good. But so take Toronto. Foodora, there was a successful union drive. They pulled out and left. They did that not because they're unprofitable everywhere, but because they could be more profitable somewhere else. So they wanted to go invest more in Southeast Asia, where they're making money hand over fist, apparently, and not in Toronto, where with the union drive and the wages that would have resulted, they couldn't make enough of a profit or any profit. Similarly with Uber and Uber Eats, I mean, I know that obviously there's creative accounting that they can use to show that they're less profitable than maybe they really are in terms of having revenue. But ultimately, are they paying dividends to shareholders? I'm not sure, but I would imagine if they are, it's not very high. And yet people, venture capitalists and others, are continuing to pour investment into those companies. And so that raises the question of why. And if organizing were successful to create unions in those sectors, would those investors continue to pour that investment into those companies? I'm sure they have a long-term strategy, which gets into all these questions about financial short-termism and all that stuff, which I don't agree with. But the question, though, of the profitability of these individual firms in particular contexts versus the need to organize those workers that work in these contexts. Like Foodora left Toronto, those workers are still now working for another company, basically the same workers that replaced Foodora, and now they don't have a union. So, you know, like that's what I mean. Like it's not the firm level, I think, creates certain challenges for us. And there's this paradox of needing a political level response against capital as a whole, especially in terms of its geographical mobility on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, the need to build some kind of grassroots base for a political shift like that at the political level. That would normally on the left, quote unquote, come through unionization in the labor movement. But in this particular sector, it seems to pose a lot of challenges. So I wanted to maybe see if I could push a little bit on that issue.
Do you want me to come back on those lines now, Michael? Right. Well, first of all, about Amazon, I don't know an awful lot about what's going on at Amazon. There have been a number of strikes in Europe, coordinated all to happen on the same day, you know, when they're doing their, I forget what they call it, sort of special offer day, among warehouse workers. But my understanding is that in the United States, there's also been organisation among the office-based workers, and that they're making different kinds of demands. But I may be wrong about that. But I mean, this is a very old problem of you know, across large companies. You're always going to have different groups of workers with different interests, and bringing them all together is a major challenge. But I mean, I'm sure you know more about it than I do. And yes, this thing about mobility of capitalism, I can't remember, I think since the 80s, I can remember the demand being raised. No free movement of capital without free movement of labor, you know, and much good it's done us, you know. We haven't been very able to successfully organize around it, although it remains a good demand, I think. But more broad, but coming to Steve's question about platform workers organizing, they do. I mean, there isn't a winning model, but we do in the UK now have there've been a series of difficult splits, and you know, these new unions. There've been all sorts of reconfigurations of the trade union movement. But there's a union called the App Drivers and Courier Union, the ADCU, which is quite strong, which chose to represent both drivers and delivery workers, because increasingly they're the same people. During the pandemic, there's been this huge growth in the need for delivery work, but a drop in the number of taxis. So you've got an awful lot of Uber drivers in their great big expensive cars that they're paying off these crippling loans on, actually using them to deliver smelly hamburgers, you know, for Uber Eats, and also some of them also working for like Amazon Fresh, you know, delivering groceries. So there's a huge sort of crossover among these different workers. So it kind of makes sense to organise across the sector, although there might be situations where targeting a particular company makes sense. One of the unions that attracted most of the headlines in the UK, the head of it has now gone back to the United States. He had a model of very much of organising by taking high-profile test cases against particular companies and splashing it all over the social media. So it was a model of get a lot of publicity and win a test case as the sort of major strategy, which a lot of traditional trade unions had a lot of problems with, because they thought that it means that you know when workers go on strike, they're putting their livelihoods on the line, and you know, you should be able to give them support when they lose their job before you lead them all out on strike. So there were a lot of issues around that. It's a kind of complicated story. But I think more broadly what's happening, I mean, what my survey results show very clearly is that actually what's happening is that the platforms are becoming more and more like regular employers. as city councils, especially usually at the city level, it's sometimes at the national level, usually at the city level in Europe, as they start to regulate. I mean, regulators don't just sit there and let things happen. They start to regulate and they start bringing in conditions, and Uber is having to behave more and more like traditional London taxis have to behave in London, and Airbnb is having to behave more and more like traditional rental companies and so on. So the platforms are becoming more and more like regular companies. But meanwhile, the regular companies are becoming more and more like platforms. They're using all these algorithmic practices to manage the workers. They're, in the surveys we've done, for every worker who says they work for a platform, who has to use an app in order to be told when there's a task waiting to be done, there are 2 who don't work for platforms who, have to do that. There are more people being managed by user ratings who are not platform workers than there are who are. So there's this huge general platformization of work spreading across the labour market, which will have spread much, much further during the pandemic, because as all the little firms go out of business, it's the big firms that tend to do it. So the spread of these practices is growing exponentially, even if new companies aren't taking them up, which of course they are. So what that says to workers and to workers' organisations is what we need is general demands. What we need is general universal demands that apply to all workers. I mean, to try and come up with a legal definition of a platform worker and have a set of regulations that only apply to them is absolutely doomed to failure. It's the business models change every 6 months. And, as soon as you've got a definition, they'll have clever lawyers who'll find a way to do it outside the definition. And that's always been the way. Look at what happened in Italy when they introduced this category of para-subordinate workers. They tried to get around the difference between employees and non-employees by introducing a category called para-subordinate workers. And because all the people who were put on para-subordinate contracts, they weren't the informal, the precarious workers, it was the formal workers. It was used as a means of casualising. And thus it will always be. And if you bring in a law that says you're a part-time worker, if you work more than 16 hours a week, everybody will be put on 15.5-hour contracts, because that's the way it works. So what we need is universal demands, which brings me back to my earlier point, that we now have a situation where there is a greater basis for formulating universal demands that everybody will buy into than ever before, because of these algorithmic management practices. Precisely, because of this general platformization. So what we need to be doing is campaigning around new sets of workers' rights, universal workers' rights that apply to everybody. I mean, including the old rights, which used to apply to everybody and got whittled away at, like the right to be represented by a trade union and the right to paid holidays and the right to a pension and the right to sick leave and, all the rest of it, which, for the last 50 years have been whittled away at by clever lawyers and neoliberal governments. We need to get those back sort of as universal rights for everybody. But we also need new rights, the right to communicate with your boss other than via an algorithm, the right to challenge an unfair customer rating, the right to see the algorithm that determines who gets work and who doesn't. But the right to challenge targets that create a health and safety risk because they make you work too hard, etc. That all that's needed really is the political will. It seems to me, because I think there's a very big consensus out there among workers. I mean, obviously the people are going to be against it. That because you're going to have the ranked forces, not just the big capitalists, who sometimes historically is the big capitalists are more likely to make compromises, like in the 70s around health and safety laws and stuff like that. But you've got all these incredibly angry small capitalists as well, these brutally angry racist, reactionaries. They're all going to be out there saying that it's destroying their livelihoods and giving workers' rights, etc. You know, there's a huge battle to be had, but it seems to me that nevertheless that's the battle we should be engaging in.
So, Ursula, thank you. I didn't get to my stack question. Steve has another one. Greg has another one. I want to point out that
I have another one. I'm clapping for Ursula because I liked her.
I thought that was your hand being raised. But this is, in many ways, this entire volume is the beginning of an organizing manual for all of us. And it was so appropriate to have you open up this series, Ursula. We only have a few minutes left, and I was going to turn to Greg to see if he wanted to refer to do any closing on this. But one point that I found very important to follow up on in the future is what is happening to the petty bourgeois throughout the US, Canada, and elsewhere. These people are being thrown into platform work as well. And quite often, the stand they take is a reactionary stand and drawing against other workers. And that is an area we in the US will really have to take up, in that when you drive on Bleecker Street in Manhattan or out in New Jersey, you can see the small shops, the small manufacturers shutting one after another, which is representing millions of workers all over the US who will not get this kind of work again. And we do need to start talking about how we will start organizing in this coming period. And that will happen in the next 14 sessions, but I'm turning the floor over to Greg right now.
Maybe I can just precisely wrap up with there. One of the premises of the volume, when we were thinking about this thinking about it with Leo and Steve and others, is in fact that there's no such things now as non-financial corporations or corporations that aren't digital. And so you kind of have them penetrated by this logic and of both financialization and digitalization, whatever they are. And so some of the challenges of organizing and so forth are related to the way that the units of capital are actually invested. And there's a huge difference between public service provisioning and the struggle over financialization or marketization in the public sector, and the way digitalization is, versus something like the logistics sector like Amazon, which has massive fixed capital investment spread out and should be able to organize in a different way. And then there are those that are like the food provisioning or the drivers, et cetera, which are much more just platforms with very limited kind of investments in particular cities, and what's invested is particularly the platform, and then workers are dispersed. We have a problem in all these kinds of companies of organizing workers that are contingent workers organized through employee agencies that then go into the big factories as well. One of the problems we have is in organizing is that, and I think the theme that we were trying to introduce here is we have to look right at this moment, not only a variety of strategies for organizing that aren't that vary with the units of production to some extent. And I think they're very much what Ursula and Steve were getting at in terms of a new set of political demands and political agencies that are more universal, are actually foundational to organizing across this both financialization and digitalization across all the corporations. That's kind of what's crucial at this moment in time. And we're not close to kind of having union movements yet that are kind of reversing kind of are able to reverse the longer term decline or the setbacks in unionization. The US is down to well under 10% of unionization. Britain's levels of unionization have fallen. I can't remember the last numbers, but almost by half or something.
It went up a lot last year.
Yeah, with the changes of the overall employment situation is too. But Britain is actually surprisingly less organized now than Canada is. and we've lost about 1/3 of unionization density rates in Canada. So there's a whole kind of reversal that has to go along with this and all the challenges of organizing digital capitalism. What we're trying to do in this volume is not only cover those changes that are occurring in contemporary capitalism and through digitalization, but it was also to kind of point to the way that we could find new ways of living through new forms of organizing, new forms of doing politics, and so on. That's the crucial thing.
Thanks, Greg. Ursula, do you have any comments to wrap up with?
Well, I don't. I think I've talked too much, actually. I mean, I'd love hearing all you guys. I just wish we could have these sorts of conversations more often. Really, I find them terribly.
Maybe we could hug. Maybe we could hug you too, Ursula.
That would be nice.
Great. This was really wonderful, Ursula. This was tremendous.
Herman had his hand up. Oh, okay. Just to say that, Herman. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Greg, Ursula, Steve, thank you so much. Ursula, thanks for your time, and see you on February 21st, which will be for reinventing the welfare state, quite related to today's talk. Well, thank you very much, and we're off to a great beginning. Thanks again.